Okay, thanks everyone. I've just hit the record button, so I just need to advise everyone that the session is being recorded and we will be publishing this on the Smart HQ site within a pretty short time frame. Now, just to recap some of the things that I mentioned for those of you who were on just before the call started, please feel free to send any questions or comments through in the chat window. And what I'll do is try to address those as we go through the content. So I won't be sort of stopping each time there's a question. Instead, I'll try to answer them at the appropriate part of the presentation. So to give some background, my name's Mark O'Shea. I'll be running through today's presentation, and also from Microsoft is Thomas Anderson, who might be jumping in and answering some of the questions, or at least he'll be capturing the things that maybe are scrolling by pretty quickly to make sure that I'm not missing anything critical that's happening while I'm not looking at the chat screen. But hopefully we get a chance to go through a few of your questions, some of the things that you may have hit. I'm sure some of you have got some questions that you may be shy to ask, but it's almost anonymous. We can't see photos of you, so please feel free to ask questions as we go through the session. So as advertised, this is a session from the OEM team on some of the licensing changes that have occurred with Windows Server, with Windows Server 2016. So it's the first time there's been kind of this major a change in Windows licensing for a while now. So it's definitely worth going through and spending a bit of time going through some of these scenarios. And what you'll see here, that third section, the frequently asked licensing questions, this is something that I tend to basically, it keeps expanding as we do more of these types of events. So when we're doing it directly to our distributor partners, when we've done it with our OEM partners, when we've done it other webinars out to partners already, we try to capture some of the questions that come through that are not necessarily variations of things we've already captured, but things where it might be a new type of question. And as much as I'd love to say, I think we've probably got most of the, I guess, the core questions covered. It's only a couple of months into the life cycle of Server 2016, so I'm pretty sure there'll be one or two new questions in here that we don't actually have documented answers in our frequently asked licensing questions, but it means we can add them in over time. So let's just jump straight in and start covering some of these changes. Now, first up, just some of the important notes here from the OEM side is that Windows Server 2016 did start shipping through the OEM channel back in late September, early October. And it's also important to note that OEM's really in a unique position where the OEM team can still actually ship Windows Server 2012 R2 until the end of this calendar year. So some of the things that we talk about here, I know that there'll be some people who might have questions around, well, what if I just want to keep licensing things the way that I want to keep licensing them? Well, in that case, Server 2012 R2, as I mentioned, it is going to be available for the rest of this year. But hopefully there are enough new capabilities in Server 2016 that you'll probably want to start thinking about how you can start taking advantage of some of those. Now, let's go in and talk about the different editions. So even though there are other editions of Windows Server that don't apply to the OEM channel, really the three primary ones we've got here are the Essentials Edition, Standard Edition, and Data Center. So I'll cover off Essentials on its own to begin with. So what's important to note with Essentials is, it's an incremental update to what Windows Server Essentials to be. So it's the 25 users, up to 50 devices, no CALs required, and it allows for one physical or one virtual instance, and it has to be the root of the Active Directory domain. So this really isn't, at a top level, it's not drastically different to the previous version. There are some additional capabilities included around integrating with additional online services versus the previous one. But overall, there are a lot of other advances that have gone into Standard Edition and Data Center that Essentials doesn't necessarily expose all of that functionality. Now, a big difference when we start taking a look at Standard Edition and Data Center Edition inside of Windows Server 2016 is that we've effectively reverted back to the previous model. So prior to Server 2012 R2 and Server 2012, when Standard Edition was effectively a subset of Data Center, or you could say that Enterprise and Data Center were a superset of Standard. And just to start off with the things that they've got in common. So they've still got the license for an unlimited number of users based on how many cows for users or devices that you purchase. Standard Edition by default still comes with the license to run 2 Windows Server virtual machines as part of that license on top of a virtualization platform, whereas Data Center has got unlimited virtual machine support. Once we get to the containers with Hyper-V, this is where we've got 2 Hyper-V containers or or unlimited Hyper-V containers. Now, there's also the section below that, unlimited Windows Server containers. So let's just spend a moment talking about containers in general here. So in some cases with containers, it may not be, or they may not be technologies that your customers are actually going to be, necessarily rolling out straight away. But for organizations that are working with software vendors or have got their own in-house dev and test staff who want to go through and start leveraging containerization solutions like Hyper-V containers, Docker, etc., these are the types of capabilities that Windows Server has now got included. Once we move to Data Center, though, and we start taking a look at some of the specific feature differences, this is really where we do start looking at some capabilities that really are, targeting, people with larger deployments versus someone with 1 or 2 copies of Windows Server Standard, for example. So some of the big ones here: storage replica, storage spaces direct. So enhancements to the storage stack so that we've got synchronous and asynchronous storage replication capabilities. Storage Spaces Direct also gives us the ability to start getting what we call hyper-converged scenarios, where we've got where we may have Hyper-V running on top of the same hardware that we also have our scale-out storage platform running on. Now, with previous versions of Windows Server, we really recommended a disaggregated approach here, where we would have the compute nodes set up as one set of hardware and the storage nodes set up as another set of hardware. Whereas with Server 2016, we're saying that for certain scenarios, it may be worth investigating actually consolidating those workloads. Now, the new networking stack is taking a lot of Azure networking type technologies and bringing them down into Windows Server. So if you've worked with Azure Virtual Networks, so Azure VNet, things like the network security groups, etc., that Azure supports, these are things that Windows Server Data Center has also got support for now. And then finally, we've got support for shielded virtual machines and the Host Guardian service. So with the shielded virtual machines, this is really all about starting to leverage some of the more advanced hardware capabilities that servers are starting to implement, I guess, more commonly now. So servers that have got TPM capabilities that are running the latest versions of UEFI, that have got VTX support, that have got other technologies like second layer address translation, so we can get really secure infrastructure not just within the VMs but also around the virtual machines to make sure it's only the appropriate users who can access what the VMs are running. So when we do take a look at the way the different versions are licensed, even though it is kind of covered on the last slide, this just highlights it very specifically. For Standard and Data Center, they're both licensed on a per CPU core basis, and we'll talk a lot more about that as we go through. And in the next one, we're talking about Windows Server CALs. So each user or device there does require a CAL. Now, for Server 2016 Essentials, it's processor-based and there's no CAL required. Now, there's a question here about, no, so this is not Hyper-V Replica. Hyper-V Replica, no, we are talking about storage replica inside of Windows Server Data Center here. So let's jump in now and take a look at the licensing overview. So what we do with Server 2016 is base the server licensing on the number of CPU cores that the server or that is being exposed to the operating system or the virtualization platform that Windows Server is running on top of. Now, there's a specific reason why I call out the operating system or the virtualization platform, and I'll come back to that in the frequently asked questions slides at the end. So I just want to put that out there so that we can loop back in on that towards the end. So once we start taking a look at this one in a little bit more detail, what you can see here, some of the scenarios that they talk about here is, if we do a side-by-side comparison with Server 2012 and 2012 R2, it was really all about 2 CPUs and 2 virtual machines effectively being included, or the rights for those were included with a Windows Server Standard license. Once we move across to Windows Server 2016 with OEM licensing, we're talking about licensing it with two different options as far as a base platform goes. We can license it with 16 cores included, or alternatively, depending on which OEM you're working with or which SKU you purchase, you've also got the ability to license it with 24 cores included. And as we go through the other licensing slides, you'll see how you can go through and start adding the additional pieces in. So what ends up happening is from a licensing perspective, effectively it's that each server must be licensed for a minimum of 16 cores. Now, on the OEM side, the way that works is that it's really, that's just what Windows Server Standard in OEM includes. So it includes 16 cores. You don't need to think about, I have to license a 16 cores minimum. It's what you get by default, unless you specifically buy the 24 core edition. Now, each processor must be licensed for a minimum of 8 cores. So for a 2-core system, that effectively means that if you've got 8 cores in each of those, then that basically brings you to that 16. Now, when it comes to the virtual machine rights, this effectively hasn't really changed. The virtual machine rights pretty much stay the same, so that for each, but instead of buying an additional copy of standard to get the additional 2 virtual machine rights, which you would have done in the past, with Server 2016, what you do instead is you license that number of CPU cores again that your server exposes. Now, for those of you who are seeing this for the first time, as we keep going through, you'll start getting an idea of some of the other changes that have, some of the way that these changes have an impact. So first up, if we take a look here, first of all, where it says all physical cores must be licensed. So this is one where there is actually, I guess, an exception to this rule, which is, or actually, let me change the term. All physical cores must be licensed. All physical cores that are exposed through the BIOS, firmware, UEFI, etc., need to be licensed. Now, the reason why I called that one out specifically is sometimes we get questions around what happens if someone disables a certain number of CPU cores so that they can get better performance out of a fewer, maybe they've got an application that prefers higher frequency rather than more cores, or maybe they need to operate within a certain thermal or power envelope. So you can disable these in the BIOS, and as long as the operating system or the virtualization platform doesn't see them, you don't need to license for them. However, I don't recommend that as a way of trying to minimize licensing, because if you've got the processing power there and you're just disabling cores to minimize the costs associated with that, you've already spent the money on the hardware. You might as well take full advantage of it. So the minimum number of licenses per processor is 8 cores, even if there are fewer cores. Now, during the early planning stages of Server 2016, there were a much larger percentage of servers being sold that had, were more in the 4 to 6 core range, whereas now we're starting to see, based on the conversations we have with OEMs, that 8 cores is really starting to become the, in a lot of cases, pretty much the entry level. So this means that that's how we get to that 16 cores. So you'll see constant references back to 8 cores, 2 CPUs, or 16 cores, and it's very, very specific. So if we take a look at these scenarios, the first scenario that we've got here, so one physical server with 2 processors and 8 cores each, well, 2 times 8 equals 16. Therefore, a single copy of Windows Server Standard with the 16 CPU cores included is covered. What about if we've got a single socket server or even a dual socket server, but we've only got one socket occupied, and we put in a server with 12 cores? Well, 12 is still less than 16, so therefore we can still buy a 16, that's 16 core base license, and we're covered for 12 cores. So effectively, if someone wanted to drop, instead of 12 core, if they said, could I put in a single 16 core CPU? And still be within the license. Well, as long as it's less than 16 cores total, then you're covered. Once we get to scenario number 3, where it's a single server but 2 physical CPUs with 12 cores each, then what you'll see here is that at that point we get to 24. So what we have to think about here is we either need to buy the 16 core base product and add additional core licenses, or alternatively, what we can do here is we can buy the 24 core base license product if that's something that your vendor does actually supply. So we'll come back and we'll talk a bit more about some of these, the way that we can start filling in some of those licensing options. So So let's take a look here. So first up, for the base licenses, I mentioned that we've got two different models you could start with. You could start with a 16 core or a 24 core license. Now, if you've got 16 cores or less, obviously 16 cores is the appropriate one. As soon as you're above 16 cores, well, really it doesn't really matter if you buy 16 or 24 core to begin with, as long as you're using the additional core licenses to fill the gap there. Now, a question that just came up, which is an important question, is what about hyper-threaded? Hyper-threaded are not physical cores. Hyper-threaded has got absolutely nothing to do with the performance, with the licensing here. But that's definitely something that comes up a lot. So, in some cases, hyper-threading can assist things. Sometimes you have to disable it depending on the type of workload you're running. That doesn't come into play whatsoever. So it's the number of physical CPU the number of physical CPU cores per CPU that you need to think about here. So don't worry about hyper-threading doubling the number of licenses that you need to purchase here. Now, let's just say that you've got a 32 core server, so two 16 core CPUs in each. Well, you could buy, pretty much as long as you're buying something from column A and something from the base licenses, whether it's the 16 or the 24 cores, and then from the additional core licenses you're adding to fill that gap. That's pretty much all you really need to know when it comes to the Windows licensing around getting the base licenses covered. Now, some of the, I guess, more interesting and not necessarily things that people are aware of when it comes to Windows Server 2016 licensing is that starting with some versions of Windows Server 2012, there were actually versions of Windows Server that started shipping that included reassignment rights. So with the reassignment rights, this effectively gives you the same hardware reassignment rights that buying through open license would give you. Now, with these options that include reassignment rights, if we tackle the first one, the after point of sale with reassignment rights, what this means is that you could buy the base license and then add the additional licenses via reassignment rights. And then when it's time to buy a new server in the future, provided it's still running Windows Server 2016, you buy the base, whatever Windows Server base license you need, and then you can migrate these core licenses with reassignment rights across to that new server. When we take a look at data center with reassignment rights, what we can do here is we can buy it including 16 cores with reassignment rights. So that way we can buy data center itself. So sometimes in the OEM channel, people will look at the cost of data center and say, well, with OEM licensing, the software license lives and dies with the hardware. I really want to make sure that I can get an extended life cycle out of the software that I'm purchasing. And that's one of the things that Data Center will give you here if you do purchase it with reassignment rights. So what's important here is understanding that the reassignment rights only apply to products that have got reassignment rights in their name. So it's not a blanket statement that all OEM server products include reassignment rights. It's only these specific listings that we've got in this slide. But I'll come back and, if you've got any questions, I can address those in later slides. Now, if we take a look at the cost of comparing the licensing models here, effectively, if you're working on servers with, if we start off with 2 virtual machines, for example, as long as we're working either with with 16 cores or less on a single or a dual socket server, then there's no change in pricing versus Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 pricing. Once we do start exceeding that, effectively what happens then is even without looking at the part numbers and the prices, it's pretty easy to calculate and get a ballpark number. It's, what's the percentage increase in the number of CPUs? So in this case, you'll see that going from 16 to 20, well, that's actually a 25% increase in price, and it's also a 25% increase in the number of CPUs that are there. Sometimes when we talk about these things, questions do come up around this, such as, does this mean that, in some cases, when I'm looking at it and I'm trying to, work particular workloads, when you start looking at things where there may be a CPU with higher the CPU frequency might be higher, but it might have a lower number of cores, for example, is that something that, behaves nicely in this kind of model? And generally what I'd say to that is, you really have to think about what the workloads are that the customer is going to be running. If the workloads are highly threaded versus something that benefits more greatly from increased clock frequency, it's not really doing the right thing by the customer by pushing them down the path of maybe 50% fewer cores but at a higher frequency. But if once it's a really mixed workload, or it's not something where CPU is running flat out all the time, if they're not doing heavy duty encoding and other bits and pieces and analysis work, a lot of the times the differences in CPU frequency may not really be all that obvious. There are probably going to be other things such as network speed or IOPS on the disk side that are going to have more of an impact overall. Now, once we take a look at the second lot of columns here, so once we move across from the price to get 2 VMs across to the price to get 4 VMs in Windows Server 2016, what you'll see here is that a slight change in the way we have to position versus with Server Standard in 2012 R2, where if someone said instead of 4 VMs, instead of 2 VMs, I want 4 VMs, and we'd say, well, just buy another copy of Standard. Well, with Server 2016, instead of thinking buy another copy of Standard, what you have to think about is, well, we need to relicense those CPUs for those additional 2 VMs. So effectively, it's going to be, in this case, again, if we're working with the 16 total CPU cores or less, effectively we're not going to see a change. But otherwise, you'll see here that it's still that direct mapping of increase in the number of cores versus what the potential price increase is going to be there. Now, a few points here on why choose an OEM server license. So in a lot of cases, some people, they just want to go through and they want to buy a license. They want it to be a transaction. They don't want there to be any real paperwork for it. They don't want to go on a subscription program. And in a lot of cases with OEM, you'll find that generally with OEM, it does come in at the lowest entry point from a price perspective. But what you have to remember though is that when you are buying OEM software, that you can still do things like add software assurance, etc., if you want some of those volume license benefits to be added. With OEM software, you can get pre-installation options, you can get the reseller option kits or ROK that have been pre-configured and optimized by the OEMs, so that you can go from 0 to 100 much faster with those servers and get be more effective for your customers in a shorter time frame. You can go through and buy your CALs, you can buy your server licenses at the same time, pretty simple transactions. And now I'll spend a little bit of time on this point here, because this is one that I think both of these are things that people don't necessarily have a full understanding of, so it's worth me spending a bit of time on those. Before I do, I'll just have a quick look. Actually, I'll come back to your question, Daniel, so I think I do explicitly cover that in some of the frequently asked questions. So first of all, let's start off with the same downgrade rights as with volume licensing. Now, with OEM software, end users get the same downgrade rights as customers with volume license. The difference isn't around the downgrade rights that are applied. It's just that the user is then granted additional rights under certain volume licensing programs to be able to then access previous versions of the operating system. Whereas with OEM licensing, when you do want to exercise downgrade rights, the user is given the right to effectively use something that they've already licensed for another system on this new system, provided they've got the current license for the new system. So if you think about this in terms of the customer buys a machine, it comes with Server 2016. The customer then advises you that the software they want to run, they've only got a support statement from their vendor that it will only run on top of Windows Server 2012 R2. Now, the assumption here from the OEM licensing side is that if the customer is running software that's older and does have those requirements, that the customer should still have a copy of their, whether it's OEM or VL or whatever, a copy and product key for Windows Server 2012 R2 floating around. Then they can apply that to the new machine, effectively exercising the downgrade rights. There's a good chance they'll have to call the activation support people and say, this is what's happening, here's the product key for the new version I've got, can you issue an override so that we can activate the new server? And they'll go through and do that for you. So when it comes to the virtual machine portability rights, now this is one that is important to understand, because effectively, again, it's the same as with FPP or volume licensing, where you do have the right to move virtual machines from one server to another, as long as you don't exceed the number of virtual machines that are running on each of those servers. So if you've got two servers that are each licensed for Windows Server 2012, or sorry, I should say 2016, but the same applies to 2012 R2 and 2012. If they're licensed for, if you've got two servers running Windows Server Standard, each of them is licensed to run two virtual machines. Now, sometimes people say, well, 2 plus 2 equals 4, therefore I'm licensed to run 4 virtual machines in any configuration that I want. Well, that's not correct. You're licensed to run 2 virtual machines on one machine and 2 virtual machines on the other machine. As soon as you, 2 Windows Server instances that are included on the other machine. If someone says, well, I actually want to run 1 on one of the machines and 3 on the other, well, then you'll need to buy an additional Windows Server Standard license or the appropriate CPU core coverage now with Server 2016 to basically allow you to go higher than what you've got currently, because Standard by default only includes the rights to run 2 additional, the 2 virtual instances of Windows Server Standard. Now for the final one, this is one that we just covered, which is that the license reassignment you can do that, but remember it's only with specific licenses. If someone does, however, say, look, I've just bought Windows Server without reassignment rights, is there any way that I can actually apply reassignment rights retrospectively? And if within 90 days, what the customer can do is, they can contact you to purchase software assurance. Software assurance can be applied to that OEM server purchase, and then that effectively will, pretty much turn that license into a VL plus SA license. So that way, then you've got those license reassignment capabilities on that server. Now, just a couple of myths, and some of these are things that we just covered, so we can go through them pretty quickly. But the first one, you cannot do virtualization with OEM server. Now, this is one that I hear certain variations of this one on a regular basis, phrased in different ways. A lot of the time, it's based on certain products that are primarily available or only available through the OEM channel that don't include virtualization. So an example of this was Windows Server Foundation Edition, which was available through OEM and didn't include virtualization rights. Now, the fact that it didn't include virtualization rights had nothing to do with it being available through the OEM channel. It was just that was a limitation of that product in order to keep the price point down. Now, next up, because OEM licenses are tied to the hardware, VMs can't be moved between servers. Well, as I mentioned, this one's just not true. Provided you are, you're sticking to the licensing constraints of the physical hardware, so in terms of the OEM license applied. So, if the server's licensed for 2 VMs or 4 VMs, or if it's, 2 instances of data center, you're free to, to rebalance as needed, as long as on standard you're not exceeding the number of virtual machines you're licensed to run. Now, this one we also just covered. So just remember that when it comes to the reassignment rights, that this only is something that is with those specific SKUs, or when someone effectively applies software assurance, at which point the OEM restrictions aren't in place, and at that point, effectively, it is a volume license plus software assurance license. Once again, we just spoke about this one, but just to cover it off again, OEM licenses don't come with downgrade rights, but as I just mentioned, they do. But what you have to remember here is that there's an expectation that the customer has got the previous version media and the previous version product key. Microsoft does not supply those unless the customer is under a volume license agreement. And then finally, as I mentioned, you can add software assurance within 90 days. So if someone gets into a situation where they realize, oh, we need to do this or that, and it's something that a volume license purchase may have been able to address, then you could go through and then add software assurance after the fact. So let's now go through some of the frequently asked licensing questions, and this is going to cover off some of the ones that have already been asked, as well as some additional things that we haven't covered off yet. So let's jump in now. So first up, because this is an OEM/system builder licensing session, not all of this may necessarily or does necessarily apply to volume licensing programs. So if you do have any questions around volume licensing scenarios, please contact your volume licensing specialist. So whether you've got a Microsoft account manager who deals with volume licensing, or your distributor you work with deals with volume licensing, they'll be able to assist you with anything that is specific to volume licensing. So let's start off with the core licensing. Now, I've already covered this one, but let's just go through because I know some people have been sort of getting on the call late. But if I disable the physical cores at the hardware level, do I need to license them for Windows Server? And no, this is one where it's only what's enabled in the hardware. So as I mentioned, it's handy for people who are looking to keep power saving down or need to bump up the per CPU performance. But it's just not something that I really recommend if someone's saying, oh, if I disable a couple of cores, I can save a few dollars. But you're also sacrificing, you're sacrificing the overall performance of the solution that you're deploying. And all up, including, your labor, all the additional costs involved in deploying, the additional, costs for the server components here are going to be quite minimal. And another one that's already been asked, so, does hyperthreading impact core count? So no, so it's only the physical cores. So if it's 8 core, 16 core, etc., it being 16 core in Task Manager, when you look at it in Task Manager because of hyperthreading, ignore the hyperthreading. It's how many physical CPU cores are actually inside the server. Now, if my new single or dual socket server purchase includes more than 16 cores, what licensing options are available to license those additional cores? So for the space between 16 and 24, it's really just a matter of buying the 16 plus the additional ones. There's no price advantage to, you don't get a volume discount for buying more cores for a particular server. So it's not like buying 24 core SKU is going to be, roughly the cost of, 20 cores if you buy them separately. Think of it that the pricing is pretty consistent, so that, effectively, if it was 20, you could buy 16 plus 2 times 2 or 16 plus 4, for example. Now, once you get above 24, that's where you basically pick and choose what's appropriate, but it's also going to be dependent on what your OEM partner is, what options they're providing you with. Because they might look at the 2, 4, and 16 core packs that are available and say, we don't really want to have all of those on our price list. We just think the price list is busy enough as it is. We don't want there to be, all of these additional options. So you might find in some cases they may say, look, we'll put the 2 on, we'll put the 16 on, but 4 won't be there. If you want 4, just buy 2 by 2. And again, there's no impact there on the pricing. Now, what if I'm running Windows Server 2016 on top of a virtualization platform such as Hyper-V or one of the VMware options, for example? Well, this doesn't affect the licensing. So it's really a matter of it's what's being exposed to the platform that Windows Server is running on top of that you need to be licensing appropriately. So if you're exposing X number of cores to the virtualization platform that Windows Server is then running on, then that's how you license that. Now, sometimes people will ask, but what if I'm only assigning 2 CPU cores to a VM? Well, it doesn't really matter what you're assigning to the VMs themselves. It's what's being exposed to the platform that the virtual machines are running on top of, not on a per VM basis. Now, this is addressing one of the questions, I think the last question on there, so the one from Daniel. So what error will you see if the server core count is not licensed correctly? Well, this is pretty much the same as other Windows Server licensing options, like Windows Server CALs. It's really, really it is up to the customer not to mislicense the technologies there. So it's not like it's not like it's they're going, well, you haven't entered product keys for the cores, for example. So on the Windows Server side, it's one of those things where, really apart from, there are a couple of things, but probably the main one where that you do have to use product keys to activate the service and keep it going, and to do the correct count is with remote desktop services CALs. But with Windows Server components, they don't implement that. So that's pretty good. So within that first range, I've already, I told you that, there are some questions that we do get a lot. So I think that covered the, the ones that we've got in there so far. So let's take a look at CALs. Now, this is one that we get certain variations of, but effectively, it's easy to answer this one. So people ask, if I'm doing this, or this against Windows Server, do I need a CAL? Yes. Now, sometimes people say, what if I'm just using it for DNS? And it's like, okay, are you accessing something on the server? Are you leveraging a service? Are you connecting in? Is there authentication taking place? Generally the answer is going to be yes. And there's also, specific documentation in the Windows Server licensing around, if someone says, oh, what if I go through some kind of multiplexing solution? And you'll see that that's basically cut off at the pass. So it's like, nope, using a multiplexer to reduce licensing requirements doesn't make a difference here. So just bear that one in mind. We do get lots of variations, and it's like, oh, they're not using Active Directory, or they're only getting an IP address, or only this or only that. Just one only is all that's needed to need that requirement. Now the other thing here that I've covered here is that you do buy, people say, what if I've got multiple servers? Well, you only need to buy it once per user or device, depending on whether device licensing makes more sense or per user licensing makes more sense for that organization. Now, this is the one that I just covered off as part of that previous question, but what services require a Windows Server CAL? And pretty much, are you running a Windows Server? Yes. Okay, how many people are on the network that Windows Server is servicing and are using anything that server is exposing? That pretty much gives you that number. So in most organizations, it's probably going to be that number, the number of users that they've got on the network is probably going to be the number of user CALs that might be required. Device CALs, or devices would determine the device CALs. Now, another question that starts coming up is around, well, what happens when you start mixing and matching, Windows Server Essentials with some of the other versions of Windows Server? So do you need to purchase CALs if your DC is Server Essentials, and then you add a second copy of Standard for other resources? Well, effectively, that one takes us back into the previous slide, which is what services require a Windows Server CAL. So remember that this applies to Windows Server Standard or Data Center. So if they're doing if those users are doing anything with that secondary server, then they do need to have the correct usage CAL there. So remember that what's included with Essentials only applies to Essentials. So let's move quickly on to Nano Server. So this one's probably not going to be too much of a concern for you just yet, but it's worth noting that Nano Server is the lightweight version of Windows Server that's headless, and it runs a very limited set of roles, and it's primarily aimed at scenarios where people are going to be deploying like large numbers of servers or large number of VMs running specific roles like web servers, Hyper-V servers, storage servers, etc. And they want the smallest, lightest weight possible version of Windows Server to run there. So with Nano Server, all of the management has to be done via remote management tools. And to deploy this in production, you actually need to have software assurance on those copies of Windows. If someone's just doing dev and test and checking it out to see what its capabilities are, you don't need software assurance in order to do that. But as soon as it's something that goes into production, then you do need to make sure that you have licensed it appropriately. Now let's move on and talk about some additional pieces around downgrade rights. So how can I license a Windows Server 2016 host but run 2012 R2 virtual machines? And this is a common scenario where someone says, look, I want to make sure that the virtualization infrastructure is the latest that's available. I want to make sure that I can leverage some of those new Hyper-V technologies, for example. But the workloads that the customer is currently running may not be certified to run on Server 2016. So what can I do? Well, this is where we just exercise the downgrade rights, not on the host OS, but on the guest VMs. So remember though that what we spoke about previously with downgrade rights, that what the user is assigned is a downgrade right. So they've got the right to downgrade, but they need to have a way of accessing the previous media and product keys to actually exercise that. So this doesn't really change that, but it's just a slight variation of that type of scenario. Now, are the Windows Server 2016 CALs suitable for Server 2012 R2 installs? So yes, you can use Server 2016 CALs for previous versions of Windows Server. So, but I guess the important thing to note with this one is the opposite isn't true. If someone's got 2012 /2012 R2 CALs, they can't use those forward against Server 2016 unless they'd already applied software assurance to those. So are the Windows Server 2016 RDS CALs suitable for Server 2012 R2 installs via downgrade rights? So Yep, but in this case, the downgrade rights is a slightly different conversation. What you actually have to do here is contact the Microsoft Clearinghouse, and what they'll do is, once you give them your Server 2016 RDS Cal details, they'll go through and issue you with 2012 R2 or 2012 RDS product keys that you can actually use to then get those CALs onto that system. So that's something that's a little bit, it is a little bit different, but as I mentioned with RDS, it's really the main thing with Windows Server that does require those product keys and that does actually actively track the number of users or the number of devices that are licensed. Now, this is one that came through on a previous webinar, and it was, why would you purchase a new version of Windows if you need to have an existing key and media for the version that you need to use? And this was really around someone not having a great understanding of OEM licensing. But remember that traditionally OEM licensing has not had reassignment rights included. So what that means is, someone sitting there going, but I've got a perfectly good copy of Windows Server 2008 running on this machine. Why can't I move it over to the other server? And it's like, well, first of all, it's 2008, so it's not a perfectly good version. Time has moved on. But secondly, if it's an OEM server, unless they specifically assign, put software assurance on it, they don't have the reassignment rights. So moving forward, as you can see, this is something that, we can't make a blanket yes or no statement with OEM now. It's like, what version of Windows Server did you purchase from the 2012 R2 timeframe onwards? So that's really all that one's trying to cover. Nothing new, just in case people weren't overly familiar with OEM licensing. So now let's move on, and we're getting close to the end of the slides here. So what we've got here is, do you have to buy reassignment rights at initial purchase, or can they be bought afterwards? So first up, you've got, what you have to do is, if you don't buy a product that includes reassignment rights, then the only way you can really add reassignment rights to that after the fact is through software assurance. However, if you're buying the version that does include reassignment rights, then reassignment rights are basically there from the beginning. So just remember, with reassignment rights, it's not a blanket right that's assigned. It's something that is only on the SKUs that have got reassignment rights included in the product names. Now, moving on, and we'll cover off virtualization. So this question is really around, when we talk about Windows Server standard scenarios around virtualization, we always use the example of 2 virtual machines because that's what's included. And a lot of the time we'll shorten it and we'll say it's licensed to run 2 virtual machines. But to be specific, it's licensed to run when we talk about the two VMs, what we're really talking about is not the total number of VMs it can run, but the total number of licenses that are included with that product. So you could run, the virtualization platform and then from that run 2 instances of Windows Server Standard there. So if someone said, well, what if I want to run, a Windows 10 Pro VM, or I wanted to run this, or I wanted to run that? Well, as long as those other products or technologies were licensed appropriately, there's nothing that would stop you from running them on Windows Server Standard. It's more a matter of if someone said, well, I've got 1 Windows Server Standard license, can I run 3 Windows Server VMs on top of that? It's like, yes, you can, as long as you buy an additional instance of Windows Server Standard or the additional number of CPU cores that are going to be required for coverage with the Windows Server 2016 approach. So again, nothing has really changed here from the overall scenario. It's just that sometimes, when we generically talk about the 2 virtual machines, sometimes people think it's some kind of limit that's enforced overall, but no, it's the number of VMs that are actually licensed based on the operating system that you've purchased. So that brings us to the end of the official section. So I guess I've been able to address a few of the questions that we've got on there, but I think Thomas has already answered one, but it's will the presentation be available? And yep, we'll definitely get this up onto Smart HQ very, very shortly. But in the meantime, I guess any other questions, if you want to type them through, there's quite a few of you there. So hopefully you've got some questions, maybe variations of some of the scenarios. If anything that I've said conflicts with anything else you've been told, or or it totally contradicts things you've been told, please make a comment about it, and I'll hopefully can get to the bottom of where those differences in opinion occur. Or from Gavin, any feedback. Okay, so the question around what's needed to license Linux VMs, well, that's up to what Linux distro you're using. You'd need to work with it. That's got nothing to do with Microsoft. So if it's a Linux distro that involves an enterprise support agreement or something like that, you'd need to talk to that Linux vendor. But if it's just one of the ones that's free and open to use, then nothing is required. So Microsoft is not involved in that whatsoever. But understand though that Hyper-V there's multiple Linux distros that are well documented as being supported running on top of Hyper-V. So a question: when a customer has 3 hosts in high availability mode, Microsoft tells me I need to triple licensing requirements. I'll assume that based on the question, I'm going to jump in, and John, correct me if I'm wrong here. So let's just say we'll keep it simple and we'll use the example of 3 instances of Windows Server Standard in a cluster, and you want to make sure that the virtual machines can run on all 3 in case of failure of up to 2 nodes. Can you just let me know if that's correct, John? Okay, so make it 4 virtual machines per host, so they've got 2 times 2 licenses of standard. So let's use that as the base. So when we start planning for high availability, effectively, if we want to really make sure we're covered from a licensing perspective, we need to think about what is the maximum possible number of virtual machines that each host could potentially license at any point in time. Oh, sorry, could host at any point in time. So if we've got a total of 16 VMs running across 4 servers in a 4x4 configuration, the easy answer immediately there from a licensing perspective is Windows Server Data Center. So the reason for that, why I'm saying Windows Server Data Center, as soon as we start looking at scaling these things out, if you're thinking that I've got to buy 3 or 4 standard licenses here, 3 or 4 there, 3 or 4 there, 3 or 4 on server number 4, all of a sudden we start getting to the point where the costs of stacking all of those copies of standard per server, all of a sudden data center pricing starts becoming much more attractive, as well as, especially now with Server 2016, with data center having additional features around some of the additional features in the data center edition. So this is something that has pretty much always been the case. There's no real there's no clause in the licensing for, oh, look, we'll turn a blind eye to it if you're trying to do recovery, etc. It's really, the licensing here is really a matter of, what's the maximum number of virtual machines you're planning on licensing per server. So even though you're thinking, well, hopefully I never have to, well, you could always choose not to license all of the servers appropriately. There's nothing that's enforcing that. But it's a matter of, if it's something where the customer does want to be covered legally and you also want to be covered legally, there, it is making sure that the appropriate base licenses are in place. And there's a question about what about restoring in case of hardware failure? Well, that depends on what hardware you're restoring to and from. If the hardware that you're restoring to is effectively covered under the same warranty as the server that has died, and effectively it's an extension of the warranty of the product that died, then that's effectively viewed from the OEM licensing perspective as a continuation of that life cycle of that server. So, but if it's something where someone has to then restore that to another server that's not licensed appropriately, and they're using OEM licenses that don't have the right for the host OS to be reassigned, then reassignment rights are something that you really should be thinking about in those types of scenarios. Okay, so a variation of some of these questions from Andre. Actually, I'll jump onto Andre's one first, and then I'll come back to Robert's one. So with Hyper-V Replica, so the thing that you have to remember when you are talking about things like Hyper-V Replica, or when I'm talking about the number of VMs that you're running on each server, it's the number of virtual machines that are running. So if you're looking at something like Hyper-V Replica, you have to think about it in, I guess there are two things you have to think about. The first one is that it's the number of VMs that are currently running on that server that you need to be licensed for. So you need to sort of think, okay, well, if it's just running 2 VMs at any point in time, it only needs to be licensed for those 2 Windows Server VMs. If it's running 4, it needs to be running 4. The number of replicas it's receiving doesn't really, really has no impact on the licensing requirements there. They should be covered by the machines where the VM is actually running. Now, the flip side to that is, well, what happens if all of the machines go offline apart from the one where the replicas are currently stored? Okay, do you want to bring those replicas online? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, what that means is that for every one of those, if it's Windows Server Standard licensing, you have to think that for every 2 VMs that you bring online, you need to have Windows Server Standard license assigned to that server in advance. So basically, it doesn't really, so it's a slight variation of some of the other scenarios that we covered, but it's the number of Windows Server VMs that are running that are licensed appropriately. As long as the base hardware is licensed appropriately at the host level, you can run as many VMs as you want. But all of a sudden, you can start seeing that, hang on, if we do the maths and work out what's the cost of standard versus the cost of data center on a per VM basis, as soon as you start trying to scale this stuff out, data center makes not just financial sense, but mental health sense, so that you don't have to try to calculate, hang on, is this covered? Have I balanced this appropriately, etc. Now, the other question that was on there was just up before that. Can you run a Windows 10 in production as a virtual machine? You'll have to talk to a licensing specialist around that, because to run Windows 10 virtual machines, that's something that can only be done through volume license programs with the appropriate VDA or VDI licensing. So you'll need to talk to one of your distributor reps around that. So you can do it, but it's not something that's done through the OEM channel licensing. So if someone just buys a copy of Windows through the OEM channel, that's not licensed appropriately to do that. It needs to be purchased through VL. Now, I'll just keep going through a few more of the questions because they're starting to scroll through this. So if you have reassignment rights or SA, can they not be moved to the secondary machine? So I'll assume this is around the virtual machines. No, so the reassignment rights in software assurance are the host machine reassignment rights. It is not around breaking the rule for the number of licenses that should be running on the host that actually has to host them. Now, what servers and software can run on the host to not require a license for the host? I'm not really. So you're saying you want to run Windows Server, but you don't want to pay for it? Well, if you're using it for something, those users have to pay for it. So basically, if there's anything where in an environment where there may just be a very specific group of people who need Windows Server for things, you'd probably want to make sure that it's not doing any kind of name resolution, that it's not acting as the print server, it's not acting as the DHCP server, not acting as the DNS server, not acting as a remote access server, etc., 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 a web server, proxy server. So basically, any service or software that's running on that server, any client that is accessing that, does need a license. Hopefully that's clear. So then another question, I'm just sort of scrolling through these. So could you potentially use reassignment rights to bring the replica online? So in that case, what you have to remember is when you've got reassignment rights, you can only exercise reassignment rights once every 90 days. So if this is a temporary reassignment, you do it, but then you have to wait 90 days before you can reassign those rights back to the original server. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a great option there. Now, John's commented on the VDA licenses. And can you run Hyper-V and backup software on the host without a license? Well, I guess it depends on what it's what it's actually backing up, and if it's running Hyper-V, as long as nothing outside of that machine is accessing what it's running on Hyper-V. But effectively, if something's connecting into it via Hyper-V, they're connecting into the network stack on the machine and then getting passed through to Hyper-V, so they need to be licensed appropriately. Now I'm just going through, I think we've still got a couple of minutes. I just want to make sure I've tried to catch everything there. So another question, if the main server goes down and is temporary, wouldn't the licenses still cover in that replica scenario? That's not something that OEM software licensing would cover, no. There may be some more advanced licensing options that do provide that, but being from the OEM team, I'm not familiar with what they would be. I'm not sure. Sorry, Thomas?
Just the last question, a fragment for VMSD from Mark.
I'm not sure what you mean by oh, okay, for VMs. So
Yes.
now I'm trying to pace back what that actually is. No, because if you're still trying to exceed the number of licenses that a server is licensed to, a number of Windows Server guests that the host is licensed to run, the OEM license does not cover that. Again, if it's, it might be something that's covered somewhere in volume licensing, but you'd need to check with a volume licensing rep on that. Okay, if they're asking about Hyper-V Server, that's not really part of the OEM server product lineup. No difference there, Jason. You get the host, so as long as the host isn't running any real additional services apart from what's required to run the virtualization services and maybe backup agent, for example, you've still got the, so I call it, instead of 1 plus 2, I call it 0.5 plus 2. So you can sort of run standalone Hyper-V, you could run Windows Server, or you could run Windows Server Core or Windows Server with GUI, but as long as you weren't trying to load Active Directory, etc., onto the host partition, it's still the same licensing. Okay, well, with that, I think that brings us pretty close to 2 o'clock. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, we've still got a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, so I'll cover off the final two. So there's one from Robert, then there's one from Bradley. If I need an additional standard license to cover, actually, it's the two questions are the same. If I need an additional standard license to cover an additional 2 times VMs on a host, does the extra standard license have to be sourced from a non-OEM model? So first of all, with Server 2016, you could do it via purchasing an additional, if it's at point of sale, you could buy you've been able to buy, or you could buy 2 copies of standard to get the 2 times 16 or 2 times 24 licenses. But if it's after point of sale, that's where you do have the option now of buying the after point of sale cores, or core packs, which will give you the additional cores to take it up to the number of virtual machines that you need to cover. So the way that you would effectively double the number of standard licenses in the past, now you have to think of it in terms of doubling the number of licenses that you're covering there. So that's good. That one handles 2 questions in one go because they're the same question. Okay, well, with that, thank you very much for the questions. It's great to see such a big turnout of people here. So this has been recorded. We'll get it uploaded onto SmartHQ, and and we'll also get the presentation itself up there for you. So thank you everyone very much for those questions. It's always great to have Lots of questions to keep us busy there towards the end. And what I'll do, I'll just hand over to Thomas quickly to see if he's got anything to wrap up with.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Mark. I hope it was cleared some of the myths and questions for everyone this afternoon. And as Mark said, we will be posting the video to Smart HQ, and we'll be conducting more of these trainings moving forward. So stay tuned for those emails once we send them out. Thanks very much for joining, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everyone.